We left off in the last portion of this lecture series dealing with historical observations. Now we'll move to the next, genre. We want to carefully observe whenever we approach a text, what is the genre of literature within which it operates. The answer you see in the case of Psalm 114 on the left is that this is poetry. Poetry as opposed to what? Well, generally, poetry as opposed to prose. When we find ourselves in a poetic passage of Scripture, here are some of the alerts that should occur to us as we seek to interpret it faithfully. The first has to do with imagery. It's more likely to encounter imagery within a poetic passage than prose. That's very, very important, because when a writer or speaker employs imagery, they're not intending us to understand that literally. They're intending us rather to appreciate what the image contributes to the meaning that's conveyed and interpret it in that fashion. The next item has to do with a feature of Hebrew poetry that we call parallelism. It's the tendency of Hebrew poetry to say the same thing twice. Actually, they're not saying exactly the same thing, but there will be a lot of similarity. And that occurs in close proximity. So the first half of the line of a verse will be very similar to the second half of a verse in many cases. Another feature of poetry is that we should expect to encounter the development of concepts and principles. As opposed to what? Well, as opposed to expecting to find chronologically sequential components of a storyline. It's as though we are being ushered in to study a speech rather than a narrative, an event being retold for us. And we approach a speech differently. We're expecting that the speaker may have an overarching theme, there may be an introduction, a conclusion, there may be specific subpoints that are developed that lead to an impression, probably a persuasive impression, towards the close. So this is the frame of mind with which we want to approach a piece of poetry. As far as the truths that we would bring from a poetic passage, we should expect to watch for underlying principles rather than the literal wording of the poem. So this is just a sampler of some of the thoughts that should be in our mind when we detect that the passage we're in is poetic. There are a variety of genre that we'll want to be sensitive to, and once again, when we get to the appropriate section in your textbook, you'll find various genre and subgenre that they will alert us to that help us, again, strip away the inattentional blindness and make sure that we're handling Scripture as it was meant to be handled. Here's a side parallel as far as the importance of genre. If you were to open up a letter from a dear friend, your mental and emotional orientation towards the information you're about to receive is going to be very different than if you open up a bill from a telecommunication company, or if you open up a mechanic's book and you're planning to fix something in your automobile, or if you open up a recipe in a cookbook. Each one of these are a different genre, and we do violence to the passage if we apply the wrong assumptions, the assumptions from a different genre, onto what we're looking at. This is what it means to be a responsible reader and interpreter of any literature, and especially this is important with Scripture. In the case of a genre observation, you can see that is very important. It does not lead to a lot of particular things that we're going to write down. It's more of an alert, an awareness, a lens that we put on. When we come to the third subpoint under observation, that is literary observation, there will be several things we will want to log in relative to any specific passage we're looking at. And there are two steps that I found very, very useful. First, we want to notice the specific literary devices that our writer is employing, but we want to be careful not to stop at that. We're not just developing a sense of an index, a catalog. We want to think about how those devices affect the message of the text. And that involves commenting on each device. You'll find, together with the folder of this week's material, This document, a sampler of literary features found in the Bible. You may have seen it earlier in a previous video piece. Here's a reminder. This can be a very useful short shopping list that will remind you of the kind of literary devices that one might encounter in Scripture. We won't take time at this point to walk through all of these. A future lecture will deal more carefully and talk about various literary devices, and indeed your textbook has many more than these that are listed here as extracts. Now we want to watch for literary devices in Psalm 114. Now, it may have been some time since you last engaged in exercise like this. Some of you may be dialing back to elementary school thinking, now, what were all those literary devices? The point of learning right now, my aim, is simply to awaken this category in your mind, to encourage you to, in fact, stop the video at this point and focus on Psalm 114. If perhaps you have printed off that handout that I pointed to, that catalog of devices that I pointed to a moment ago, you might want to reference that and remind yourself of a few devices. Obviously, you're not turning this in. It won't be graded. It's just a chance for you to turn on that sense of searching for devices, apply it to Psalm 114 for a minute or two, and see what you come up with. Then I'll follow by showing you some that I've seen and point out how awareness of these devices can help us. Go ahead. Pause the video, see how many literary features you can list. I'll put up the scripture on the next screen, and then there'll be some time for you to make your own list. If you've restarted the video, that tells me that you're ready to move on. So let's take a look at this passage relative to some literary devices. Here are some that stood out to me. In verse 1, we have the reference to Israel and to the house of Jacob. We'll observe that these are synonyms. The writer is saying the same thing twice in slightly different ways. If we were to weigh the one against the other, we might conclude that there's a bit of movement, progression, growing a bit more specific, moving from Israel to the house of Jacob. Some might say that the expression house of, and then a proper noun like house of Jacob, is narrowing in on the family unit. Obviously, it's a very large, extended family, but giving you the sense of a family unit as opposed to simply a political entity, Israel. So the effect of this seems to be a slight sharpening of focus. Incidentally, this happens to be one of those cases of parallelism, verse 1a over against verse 1b, and within that, it's not surprising that we find a little sharpening that often happens in the second element of parallel expression in Hebrew poetry. In verse 3, we can see the device of personification being employed by the writer. A body of water such as a sea does not have an organ of perception, such as implied by looking. It doesn't have the ability to flee. Certainly it can move as it's acted upon by gravity or things of that nature, but it cannot, of its own volition, choose a direction of motion. And yet those traits are attributed to the sea and to the Jordan River. If you can imagine that happening, imagine the sea lying placidly there, and then somehow perceiving that someone or something is near it and responding with flight. I believe you'll find your imagination informing your brain. This is a very vivid picture. It's also a bit bizarre. It's highly unexpected because the sea shouldn't respond that way, yet the way it acted would lead one to believe that it could perceive and then flee. Personification, then, the effect of it, again, we always want to ask ourselves, what does the writer's choice of this device do to the message that he or she is conveying? How does this tool of personification contribute to what they're building in their literary creation? Personification is connected with increasing vividness. Another personification, perhaps you notice there in verse 4, mountains skipping like animals. Again, vividness. Now in verse 4, the fact that the activity of the mountains is compared to the activity of rams and lambs, here's a simile. What's going on here is the use of the simile. The writer is able to help us think with him, help us enter into his mind and appreciate how these mountains were behaving, because they're behaving in a fashion that normally you wouldn't think of mountains doing that. You think of mountains as being stable, right? He's saying, no, what we saw back then, what those Israelites saw, the mountains were not stable, but somehow I've got to get the reader to imagine, to realize what it was like. What do they know that moves around a lot? And then he thinks of animals that they would see in the field, rams and lambs. Well, that's what I'll do. I'll make the link between normally stable mountains and something highly mobile, rams and lambs. That's what similes do. They help you see something that you wouldn't normally associate with the subject that the writer is talking about. Here are several more literary devices. Something as basic as repetition in verse 5. And you see the elements that we've seen earlier in verse 3. That's the sense of repetition from verse 3 recurring in verse 5. What does repetition do? And again, such a simple device, one that you can teach a children's group to begin to watch for as they are exposed to Scripture. Repetition typically will underscore a theme that the writer wants us to be impressed by. Oh, by the way, we want to be careful when we're employing repetition. Sometimes I've noticed people engaging in an exercise like this will observe the conjunction and repeated several times, and, or the article the, and they'll say, look at this repetition. We do want to be careful only to spend this ticket of pointing out repetition, spend it on something significant, not insignificant conjunctions or articles. Let it be for significant words that are repeated, and also it can be applied to concepts. They may not be the literal words repeated, but you'll say, well, this word and that word are different, but they're speaking about the same thing. Perhaps running and walking. Well, the writer's talking about some mobility or transportation or movement. Weeping and crying, not the same word, but both expressions of sorrow. So whether it be a literal word or concept repetition, we want to watch for this. Very, very valuable. In that same verse, verse 5, we notice the use of a question. Now, questions can be of a couple of sorts. Either way, a question prompts reflection. They're inviting a response, right? Sometimes the response will be actual, like someone saying, what time is it? And they're wondering, they're hoping you can fill in a gap of information. Sometimes, however, as you know, questions can be rhetorical. And in that case, the sort of reflection that's being prompted is of a much more profound sort. So we want to pay attention to questions and how they're being used within a passage. I'll tip my hand at this point. In this one, since it appears that an answer is given in verse 7, 7 and 8 as well. Since it appears that there is an answer here, I would be inclined to say that the question in verse 5 is, and 6, there's a couple of them, that these are not rhetorical, they are actual questions. Yet, did this person actually inquire of the mountains and the seas? Well, you can't do that. So it's still imaginary, but it's a question that for which the writer is going to supply an answer. You see in verse 6, another element that's repeated. By the way, are you noticing this business of the skipping and the movement? This is something the writer wants us to be attentive to. This is a point he's making, and this will contribute to our awareness of really the central theme of the poem. In verse 7, it stands out to me that this word tremble, grammatically, it's an imperative. It's issuing a command, right? It's the only one in the whole poem. That's interesting. Now, some things which occur only once, they have no repetition. Maybe that's because they're insignificant. However, notice where this occurs. It's towards the end. It's the first word in this answer to the double question of 5 and 6. I want to allow this solitary imperative to perhaps be a very monumental piece of this poem. Commands, they get hold of you, right? Looking at that same word tremble there, the bottom point on this page, that reminds me of something else. Do you remember when the sea fled? When the Red Sea or the Jordan River turned back, when the mountains were skipping, and here, since it's geological skipping, this is not happy-go-lucky movement, but rather earthquake. And the word skipping, with its English connotations, might lead us astray there. This is terrifying skipping. This is choose your recent current events earthquake. Whatever has happened recently when you're watching this video, I'm thinking of some in the recent past when I'm recording this, and I'm thinking about the people in those countries or in those cities that were just so devastated, and fatalities happening because the mountains skipped. So this is a terrible thing. Can you see now that skipping and turning back and fleeing have a semantic, have a meaning overlap with this imperative tremble? For the fleeing, turning back, and skipping is the features of the earth are trembling. They themselves are displaying this response. And I'll go ahead and say it's a response because something has happened that makes them respond with trembling. So what we're doing literarily, the last point on this page, we're observing a repetition, not of a identical word, but now it's concept repetition. Very, very valuable because you see the poem is composed to get 1 or 2 points through, and our job as interpreters, as readers, is to sift it and see, to ask it in effect, what's the big idea? What's the main idea? What's going to be recurring through here? If this were a fabric, a tapestry, we would be looking for a dominant color that the artist has woven into it and say, which is the main color? Where does it show up? And that would help us organize the poem so that we hear its main message. You see, what we want to do is major on the majors in Scripture, not major on the minors. We've got to find out first what those majors are. Then we can major on them, both in our own lives and as we explain the Scripture to others. All right, we've got one more page. And by the way, I'm noticing the tone of my voice is getting more and more animated, isn't it? You can tell I get excited about these literary observations. I wonder what's happening in your heart and mind as you're walking through this process. Some of you, perhaps, for some of you, this is new. You've never attempted something. It seems like a foreign language itself to endeavor to lift out and isolate literary devices within a passage. You may be thinking, either one, I'm not sure it's worth it, or number two, I don't know if I can do this. May I reassure you, I believe it is very much worth it because it helps us more effectively, more efficiently zero in on God's core messages in Scripture. And definitely you can do it. And you'll be on the way just as a result of walking through this, watching this presentation, and then you'll have a couple of opportunities through homework exercises to practice it yourself. So here, top of the screen, repetition. Once again, a garden variety device. It's probably the very simplest one. And yet, in this particular poem, it's going to be this device of repetition that I believe is focusing us in on something that, if it is not the major theme, it's very close to the major theme of this poem. Notice what's repeated. This sense of God and us, the proximity, the gap closing so that He is near, He is present. We find it repeated within the same verse. Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob. Now, I find I need to check myself as a person from the West who tends to be in a hurry, particularly with written information. We're trained to speed read, aren't we? We're expected to extract written information rapidly. Consequently, when I run into something that's expressed twice, I'm programmed to look at the second mention of it as a waste of my visual time. Don't tell me twice, I already got it. You're talking about presence. Give me something new. This is how I'm programmed to respond. I found particularly in poetry that's coming from the Old Testament, the Hebrew poetry, they like to say things twice, and this can be an alert to an important theme. I believe that's very much the case here. Here's part of the reason for that. Not only is it verse 7 that has this presence, focusing on this is God's presence in each case, that God comes near. But notice also the mention back in verse 2 of God's sanctuary. Judah became God's sanctuary. Judah used to just be kind of on their own, but there came a time when God moved into their neighborhood. Judah became the place where, in a particular way, God was present. All this to say, in verse 7 is not the first time this poet has referred to this concept of God being near. He did it way back in verse 2. And that seems to be the punchline of the Exodus. Verse 1 was the Exodus, right? When Israel came out of Egypt, house of Jacob from a people of strange language. And okay, we're responding to the poet. Yeah, all right, I got that in mind. Something happened then. What happened then? Oh, what happened then was verse 2. When God got Israel out, here's what happened. Here was in effect, the objective of the liberation from Egypt. The objective was this: Judah becoming God's sanctuary. Easy to read past that way, way too fast. We should look at that first line in verse 2 and kind of, it should rock us back on our heels. We should be saying, wait a minute, you got to be kidding. The God of the universe, took up a residence in a place, and that's where people could find him. He confined himself to some degree. I'm not suggesting he was no longer everywhere in the universe and outside it, but he identified. There's no getting around it. You read the accounts in Exodus, no getting around it. God showed up and said, say, could I move into your neighborhood, Israel? I want to be your God. All of this was formalized as if it were the real estate transaction. You have a renter, somebody who wants to move in, and of course God's the owner, but the metaphors get a little mixed at this point. All that happened at Mount Sinai. And as soon as I say that, you should be thinking, oh, this poem's been referring to Mount Sinai, earthquakes, right? And the Red Sea parting so people could get to Sinai. And incidentally, when the Jordan was crossed, that's so the people could get into a land where they would be at home and God would be in the middle of them. So, the concept of God's presence, mentioned twice in verse 7 here, is linking to something the poet said earlier that was very, very pivotal. The objective of the Exodus, in his understanding, the objective of the Exodus was to get God into the community. Judah became God's sanctuary. Now the next item in verse 7, 7b, is another repetition, the prepositional phrase of Jacob. God of Jacob, house of Jacob. Here's a little footnote on particular types of repetition, and it has to do with where in a composition we find the respective parts that are being repeated. This is an 8-verse composition. The first mention of house of Jacob was up at the top, verse 1b. This one is coming, admittedly, not in the very last verse, verse 8, but pretty close to the last verse, verse 7. And that's why we say it contributes to closure. Closure is when you draw together thoughts from the beginning and the end of a composition. By the way, we see the device of closure operating in sitcoms all over the place. Think of some police mystery sitcom or some group that is trying to rescue people. So many of them begin with the rescue team, whom you know from the ongoing series, sitting in a pizza house or at a tavern, at a bar, relaxing after work, and then somebody says something, and then they discover that there's a dilemma they need to solve. Now fast forward to the end of that sitcom. Where do you expect to see them? They're back in that same pizza house or in that same bar, and now they're celebrating the fact that they apprehended the aggressor and brought justice and resolution. The fact that the beginning and the ending are similar is testimony from modern screenwriters to say, we like closure. Closure works for us. It helps us tie off a piece, and the reader or the viewer comes away with a sense of resolution. Now, in the case of closure operating in biblical material, not only can it give us a kind of a smooth feeling that things are tied off neatly in a composition, but it can also contribute to identifying the theme, or at least some concept that is important to it. So be aware of repetition significantly positioned in case it may alert you to closure. What do we have in verse 8? A rock being turned into a pool, a flint into a spring. Notice this word reversal. Reversal is a device wherein something happens that you really would not expect. The strong person is overcome. The weak person succeeds. Things of this sort. Now, the sort of reversal we see here is typically a rock does not generate fluid, does not generate water. And parallel fashion, flint into spring. That's repetition, by the way. Those two, repetition of concept. And each of them is a separate example of reversal. Reversal is a powerful device. You want to be on the lookout for this, because when the writer does that, it should shock us, and we want to register that shock. We want to say, oh, this shouldn't be the case. It must be something important, a point the writer is trying to make. And indeed it is here. It is a point the writer wants to make. It has to do with the character of God and what he's capable of doing. He can do things that really surprise you. This reversal happens to be beneficial, doesn't it? If you're thirsty, a rock's a bad thing. It's doing you no good. But when something that does you no good meets your desperate need for a drink of water, then this reversal is a good one. Some reversals are of a negative sort, shall we say. The last point that I'll draw our attention to here is the comparison between the link between rock and flint. So those are synonyms, right? Pool and spring, those are synonyms. But think about them closely. Rock in comparison to flint. Would we not agree that flint is a subcategory? It's a specification of a rock. And what kind of specification? Well, think, for example, what if instead of moving from rock to flint, we move from rock to soft clay? What's the difference between those two? Rock to flint versus rock to soft clay. Well, since one of the ideas that's being thrown around in this poem is obtaining water, where are you more likely to find water? Rock that progresses to flint, or somehow the next example is flint, or rock that moves to clay? I think it'd be easier to find it in clay. At least that's the case in my backyard, if it's the spring. A lot of clay in where I live, and you don't have to dig down too far when it's in a good season of the year. You get water coming right up. But try doing that if there were flint. What we have is the writer saying not only does God bring a pool out of rock, he can bring water out of the most unlikely kind of rock to get water out of. Hard rock, as you probably know, back in that culture. And by the way, this would be a point of historical observation. It would be to ask the question, what did they think of when they heard the word flint? What they thought of was knife blades. At least in the earliest era. Perhaps when this was written, they were already using copper and then iron. I don't know exactly. The fact that they've crossed the Jordan, well, that's something we could debate. What's the metallurgy? What are their technological abilities at the time of composition? But even if they're already making knife blades and so forth, the more I think of it, that's likely. Still, they would be aware that in earlier times, the only kind of cutting implements they had were made of flint, and the technology was that they would get a thin piece of flint, and then they would put, like saw teeth, we call it denticulation. They would chip it away, so they would be in effect saw teeth on this, and it could cut. It was used for hunting. It would be used for food preparation. All right, so again, the historical observation is this audience would immediately connect with the fact that flint's really tough stuff. Moving from rock to flint is moving from kind of hard to really hard, and really impossible to find any water around coming out of a piece of flint. That's stupid. It's almost hilarious. All right, how about pool and spring? Here's my question to you. If you envision a pool out in the woods somewhere, or a spring, which one will you want to take your water container to and fill it up? Which one will give you a better drink? In case you haven't figured it out, a pool can get stagnant. A pool can get scummy. Spring, that's flowing. You want to go for the spring. So in these two simple synonyms, the poet has moved us from the moderately valuable, a pool, to the very, very valuable, inviting spring. This is a progress of intensification. And we've taken a little extra time, but this will alert you to something that's very, very valuable when you're reading, particularly in the Old Testament and in poetry, when you find the same thing expressed twice. We call that parallelism within close proximity. Here it is within the same verse. Watch for intensification. And as you tune into it, the passage will come alive to you right there and say, oh my goodness, this is a really important point. It's something that's becoming either more beautiful, or maybe the intensification is of a negative sort. It's becoming more hazardous, and you will find the electricity of the passage will get into you and will help you then get into the message and be able to express it better. Well, we've taken a fair amount of time on literary observations, haven't we? It's such an extremely fruitful skill. You won't be practicing literary observations this week in this particular portion of the course, but I hope this gives you an idea of how the process of literary observations can serve to, again, you're going to get tired of hearing this, but to take away our unintentional blindness so that we can really hear what God is saying in His Word. We'll segment the video of the lecture at this point. The next one will introduce logical outlining and some succeeding features of the exegetical process.